Thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Sustainable Business Council's annual sustainability lecture with Stiv Wilson. I'm thankful for all of you to be here and to be invested in and taking part in the work of sustainability and to learn from Stiv. And I'm excited to introduce Blake, who will introduce Stiv. And I am excited to thank all of our sponsors who have generously made this whole event possible. So I'd like to thank the School of Business Administration here at the University of Montana for their generous support over many years of the Sustainable Business Council. I'd like to thank Axiom IT Solutions. I'd like to thank Balance Tech and Susan and John Anderson. And other key sponsors include Molly Galusha of Buttercup Market and Cafe, Missoula Indoor Ads, Missoula Independent, Big Sky Brewing, Silk Road, Goldsmiths, Bed and Breakfast, Black Coffee Roasting. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm going to pass it to Blake in a moment. One last thing you've been seeing flashing by up on the screen here is the Give Local Day is coming up next week, and I'd encourage all of you to participate in some way, shape, or form. If that includes the Sustainable Business Council, we'd be eternally grateful. But I'd like to put that on all of your horizons. So my name is Caroline Sims. I am with the Sustainable Business Council. I'm on the board, and I'd like to introduce Blake Nicolazzo, who is also on the board of the SBC, and she has been integral in getting Stiv Wilson here with us. Without further ado,
Thanks everybody for being here. So it'll work like this. Stiv will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave some time for Q&A. He spoke in a class today, and the Q&A was really lively and great. So think of questions as the talk is going on, and feel free to ask. And we'll try to leave that to about 15 minutes, knowing that sometimes they go a little bit longer. If you have to leave, that's totally okay. We can continue a conversation, but we're hoping to wrap by about 8:15 or 8:20. And then, yeah, I'm Blake Nicolazzo, and I met Stiv Wilson super long time ago. We worked at a restaurant here in Missoula together, and then we went our separate ways, and then both lived in Portland at the same time. I walked down the street, and there's Stiv Wilson. I'm like, what's up, you know? And it's like this weaving of friendship, right, over the course of time. And then several years later, we bumped into each other at Outdoor Retailer, which is the outdoor brand trade show down in Salt Lake City, and we got caught up there, and I was like, oh, you're doing so many amazing things. And then he was starting the Five Gyres Institute and sailing around the world and studying plastic waste. And not many of you know me well, but those of you who do know that I'm like a cop when it comes to plastic. And I bum a lot of people out, but all I'm really looking for is progress. And I think that expectations are dangerous, but I think we should probably be holding ourselves and others to some higher expectations when it comes to supply chain and what we're even using in our homes and our businesses. So when the Sustainable Business Council board sat down and thought about who would be ideal to come and talk, because we've had a lot of success with the Zero Waste Guide and a lot of involvement and movement around really challenging our values and ideals. And I was like, oh my God, Stiv is now working with the Story of Stuff project. And so you'll hear more from him himself, but I guess for me, one of the coolest things about this is that this started with a friendship in a restaurant, and you never know who you're going to meet, and keep in touch with those people because they turn out so beautifully sometimes. So with that, welcome Stiv.
Thanks so much. It is truly an honor to be back here. I love Montana. I lived here for about 8 years, graduated from UM with a philosophy literature degree, and then did a linguistics master's. And the linguistics master's was only because I didn't want to leave, and I was trying to figure out how to stay because I couldn't make a living at the time. And yeah, I'm the campaigns director from the Story of Stuff project. We're located in Berkeley. I live in Berkeley on a sailboat there. To avoid Bay Area rent. And I know things are getting more expensive around these parts as well. But I've been with the Story of Stuff project, which we just call the project in-house, for a little over a year and a half, but I've been collaborating with them for about 3.5 years. Our founder, Annie Leonard, when she moved on to take over Greenpeace USA, she installed me to continue the work she did. And our model has changed. I've sort of reorganized the organization a little bit. We were doing stories, viral cartoons, and how many of you have seen a Story of Stuff video? That's good. The only country we have not cracked yet is North Korea. We're still working on that, but we have a blackout there. But we have wide distribution in China. It's amazing. Our films have made it into almost any language you hear on the planet. We have a lot of crowdsourcing translations. We made about 14 films to date on vexing issues of the materials economy. And our style and our communication is to be solutions-oriented and positive. There's a lot of doom and gloom in the environmental movement, and so I'm going to start you off with a little bit of doom and gloom, but then sort of work backwards into some solutions. Originally, I got interested in the issue of waste. I'm fascinated by waste. Anthropologically, it's always made sense historically to discard the things that are not useful. Problem is, past the Industrial Revolution, these things have become persistent and they accumulate in the environment. And the number one lens where I started getting interested in the environment was plastic. I started surfing when I was 30 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, on the coast of Oregon. And there's this break that is very remote. And for those of you who've been to the Oregon coastline, you know, it's a lot more remote and undeveloped compared to other parts of certainly the eastern seaboard and certainly California, where I live now. And I was coming in from surfing, my dog Pork Chop was running along the beach, and he was getting into some stuff he shouldn't be getting into. And I looked at what he was getting into, and you know, here it is, it's a pristine old growth primeval wood that you can't see a human-made object from this vantage. And there was all this plastic and garbage on the beach. And I was like, wow. I didn't ultimately react to it from an environmental standpoint. I reacted to it from an aesthetic standpoint. I study philosophy here. Specifically, I was really interested in the theory of beauty. And what I noticed is that plastics in the environment were juxtaposed with sort of the natural order, were really incongruent to what the natural order is. The shape and the color, and it assailed my senses, and it put me on this crazy journey that, oh, where's the clicker? I swear I've done this before. But it put me on this amazing journey. At the time, I was a journalist. I left here as a writer, did a play at the Crystal, and was trying to make it as a playwright, and quickly realized you're gonna be broke forever if you do that, even if you're successful. So I was a middle-class kid from Minneapolis, and I was like, what do I have to complain about as a writer? So like trying to find my artistic ennui for like a decade, and realized journalism's the way to go because I can write other people's story, and I was more fascinated with other people. So after this day, I started writing about plastics in the ocean. And at this time, it was 2006, 2005, there hadn't even been an article in a national publication about how much was accumulating out there. And I just got fascinated, and it led me on this journey to really look at where away is. You know, at Story of Stuff, we work on the materials economy, the things we use, make, and throw away. But where was this mythical place of away? And so this is where it started. This is where the start of disposable culture in the United States happened. This is a picture from Life magazine from right around 1970. I think it's like 1968. And this was the beginning of disposable culture. And what you see depicted here is a very happy family that they don't have to do dishes anymore, apparently. And the idea was you could simply discard these materials. plastic production was starting to go through the roof, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the talk. But ultimately, I got fascinated with the garbage of our world and the things we discard. And I started looking for this mythical place of a way. And I found it. And I found it traveling and sailing 35,000 nautical miles around the world. To give you a little context, the Earth is about 18,000 nautical miles at the equator. So I'd like to say I sailed around the world twice, but I went from continent to continent. I didn't actually go around Cape Horn, but I did survive a hurricane in the North Atlantic, which was pretty sketchy. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But this place, this is Manila Bay in the Philippines. It's a mega city, about 30 million people. And as this country is developing, it's consuming a lot of these, what I call fast-moving consumer goods. And when I say fast-moving consumer goods, we're talking about single-use plastics. We're talking about things that you use very quickly and discard. Well, the problem is, the Industrial Revolution gave us this divine power to create so many things and this amazing material of plastics, but it didn't give us the divine wisdom on how to wield that power. So ultimately, this stuff is accumulating like crazy. And when I started searching for a way, I found it. And I started looking at materials and what the worth of materials are. And if you think about plastics this way, the fact that they let you walk out of the store with something in a package means inherently it has no value. Yes, we can recycle it, but often the economics of recycling don't work. Certainly in mountain communities like Missoula, it's very challenging to recycle some of your materials because they have to travel so far to actually be sorted and processed. The closest facility that can service a town this side is Tacoma, Washington. It's a tremendous amount of distance to travel, and literally trucks of plastic garbage traveling back and forth between Tacoma. So in Manila Bay, this was a really different experience for me because I was looking at plastics as an environmental issue, and I started looking at it from the lens of the people who have to deal with it. We export most of our plastic waste onto other developing countries. And there's about 5 countries in the world that take most of it. China takes 56% of all the world's recycle or to be recycled plastic. So we export a tremendous amount because we import way more than we export as a country. So those ships are going back empty. So they're willing to take these discarded materials to see if they can get some value out of them. Ultimately, it breaks down in a lot of the countries that it moves through. The supply chain for recycled plastics is really strange and really murky. It's very hard to track when you throw something in a recycling bin where it ultimately ends up and what kind of product it's turned into. So I started following this chain as best as I could. And this is about chest deep in a mangrove estuary in Manila Bay of plastic bags, high density polyethylene. Very, very difficult material to recycle from an economic standpoint. Virgin plastic is much cheaper. And I love animals, and the interaction as I was sailing and seeing all the animals that were entangled, ingesting, et cetera, of plastics really pushed me sort of over the edge, and I moved from sort of journalist to activist, and I'll tell that story a little later. So if you ever want to know what the value of waste is, the guy in the background of this picture, he's sort of hunched over here and he's picking stuff up off the ground. This is a waste picker. You find them in India, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, China. What he is doing is looking for a specific material, and that's PET, #1 plastics. This is the only thing that will get him about $1.50 a day to feed his family. The problem with that paradigm is in globalization, you're building communities of people who have no expendable income to buy in bulk. So the packaging gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So literally, when you go to the store in Manila, you buy shampoo in a ketchup pack size container. And that's a very, very difficult material to have any sort of end-of-life scenario. So what happens is you have this stuff called residual. So all the stuff that is of no value ultimately literally gets discarded at their feet. This is a material recoveries facility in Manila next to a closed landfill called Smoky Mountain. And after people sort through it, some are more organized, some are just freelance waste pickers. What they call it is the informal economy there. About 30% of the 30 million people who live in Manila are part of this informal waste picker sector. They just leave it at their feet. It becomes very problematic from a management standpoint because you're in a place that is just railed by typhoons over and over and over again. So when a typhoon comes through, this will literally go all back into the ocean. So I also had a transformation in the Philippines when I started looking at waste as a lens, through the lens of human rights. This is a waste picker. He lives in the landfill, and what he does is he mines that landfill every day to create some sort of subsistence income. His children, when they are able to walk, will be picking through waste again. They will never be registered with a birth certificate. They will never learn to read. They will not go to school in this scenario because the amount that they are making from picking waste is so small. And in order to feed them, they have to work. So let's backtrack a bit. And so how did I get here? Well, the first step to understanding a problem of this big a scope is to understand how much is out there. So I started a nonprofit with a couple of folks from Santa Monica, and literally that's what we were going to do. We were going to sail around the world and sample the ocean surface every 50 nautical miles and bean count the plastic and publish a paper. And that took about 4 years to do over time. Much cheaper to sail than it is to burn diesel. And we were taking crew members along the way with us who are help subsidizing the trip. So we were able to do the first global estimate of plastics in the ocean. What we do is we use this device called a Mantitrol, very rudimentary device, just skims the surface of the ocean, and ultimately all the plastic would seep out, we would count it and extrapolate between the size of the opening of the trawl, the distance traveled, how much water flowed through it, and we could extrapolate out to a square kilometer. In the densest parts of the Pacific Ocean, for example, the mean is about 65,000 particles per square kilometer. And a kilometer is not actually that big when you're looking at it in terms of 70% of the Earth's surface, which is the ocean. And you know, when I go to inland communities or mountain communities, understand that this is all flowing downhill. So all the things that we use ultimately end up in the ocean. And it's really interesting to look at watersheds as they pick up more and more waste as they make their way to the ocean. But we're ultimately just scratching the surface on how much waste is out there. Our paper that we published estimated the amount of plastic in the ocean at 5.25 trillion particles over 270,000 metric tons. So literally about the amount of plastics that we as a global society consume per year is about what's in the ocean, and it's growing algorithmically at this rate, as is consumption. Why I'm sharing this photo is we are scratching the surface. Half the plastics we use sink, so you'll never be able to count them on the ocean surface. The other half float. Polyethylene, polypropylene, the two most common types. Polyethylene is like plastic bags. Polypropylene is like yogurt tubs. Well, ultimately, they will float and you'll be able to count them. But with any kind of wave action, they'll get stratified down into the water column where they're bioavailable to a host of organisms. So when the sea conditions come up, as they do when you're sailing, you are getting a skewed result. So 5.25 trillion particles is ultimately a very, very, very small estimate. I think it's very conservative. To give you an idea of how much 5.25 trillion is, it's about roughly 5 or 6 times the amount of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. This is the Intrepid Sailor photo. I just put this one in for posterity, and a shout out to my dad who taught me how to sail. Ultimately, this was part of my journey, is because I was a sailor, I was able to participate in this research. This photo I took, this is in the North Atlantic, and this is what a garbage patch looks like. When we talk about these sort of Texas-sized garbage patches out in the middle of the ocean, they aren't like an island as the media has often described them. They're more like a plastic soup, and I'll have a few slides that demonstrate that. But here, this is a patch of sargassum weed, which is ubiquitous in the North Atlantic. It's called the Sargasso Sea. It sort of intertwines together, and it's very important habitat for juvenile animals in the ocean, mainly sea turtles. They go here to escape predators because from below, it appears as though it's a big organism. In this 10 to 20 foot piece of sargassum mat, probably 7,000 to 8,000 pieces of plastic just in there. And remember, we're about 2,000 nautical miles away from land at this point. So when I took this photo, I was tired of trying to get this issue out to the public through journalistic avenues because I was often having to balance viewpoints. 50% say plastic is great, 50% say plastic is bad, when the majority of the research was saying this was an increasingly more problematic material. When I took this photo, I went below deck. I had a media company at the time, and I emailed my business partners via satellite and said, I quit. I'm going to work on this for the rest of my life. So what does it look like out there? This is what a typical sample looks like. To give you sort of an idea, if you look at the little black circle in the middle, that's about this big. It's a truck tire from like a Happy Meal toy or something like that. This was taken off the coast of Japan. And the problem with plastic is it doesn't biodegrade in a meaningful time frame. And when I say meaningful time frame, that's really the important note here. Depleted uranium biodegrades, okay, but not in a meaningful time frame. The way nature works is we have this very efficient carbon cycle where you have birth and death and regeneration. When something dies, it becomes nutrients for other life. Plastic itself is made to fool nature itself. So what you're looking at is really long chemical half-lives. It's also what makes the material useful, because it is extremely resilient. My sailboat is the biggest piece of plastic I've ever owned. It's fiberglass. It's 10,000 pounds, and I affectionately named it Nurdle. Nurdle is a pre-production plastic pellet, and everything you use and make starts out as a BB-sized piece of plastic. So when I say it's like a plastic soup, this is what I'm talking about. This is what it looks like in the center of the garbage patch. The best way I could describe it is if you were to take a perfectly starry night and you were to supplant that view onto the surface of the ocean, the stars would represent the plastic and the space in between the ocean surface. And it goes like that for infinity, for weeks and weeks of traveling through it. So plastic photodegrades, if we think of it chemically like a pearl necklace. So the hydrocarbon molecule that makes the plastic is the pearl. The string between it is the polymer chain that holds it together. The string is very weak compared to the pearl. And so ultimately, ultraviolet light and mechanical action from waves breaks it and makes it brittle. It also makes it useful or useless from a recycling standpoint. So you can't really harvest it and use it from any sort of economic benefit. So it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. This is a piece of a milk crate. Lots of derelict fishing gear out there. Now we use fishing nets are nylon and polypropylene, persistent materials. And so I like this photo because it sort of juxtaposes the perfect, clean cerulean blue of the middle of the ocean with it being befouled by the stain of humans. And you find big stuff out there. This was actually a piece of tsunami debris from the tsunami that hit, I think now 3 years ago in Japan. We were trying to track tsunami debris between Japan and North America, and we came across this piece of boat. It's a pretty cool thing to swim in the middle of the ocean. It's 4,000 meters deep. But what's out there? Well, it's fast-moving consumer goods largely. The things we use most and discard and the things we use outside of the house are the things that are most likely to escape the waste stream. So when you're thinking about what has the potential to get in the environment, about 50% of the plastics we make are for single-use items. And that's a tremendous load on the environment that's accumulating. This is a mellow yellow bottle about 3,000 nautical miles from land, just floating by. Other things you see out there, bucket lids, mop squeegees, antifreeze bottle, you name it. If we use it and it's made of plastic, it is in the middle of the ocean. Medical waste, big problem with dumping of medical waste. One of the problems with materials management is it is never going to be cheaper than to illegally dump something. So when you're looking at any sort of business paradigm or economic paradigm, there's no technology and there's no management system that's ever going to be cheaper than throwing it out your window. That's the easiest way to deal with things. Well, there's 7 billion people on the planet throwing things out their window. And medical waste is extremely expensive to get to discard responsibly. So what I like to say is that plastic it's not just in the environment, it's a dominant feature of the environment. A good buddy of mine who has a nonprofit in Bozeman called Adventures and Scientists for Conservation is doing a study of the Gallatin River. And he's looking at fibers that are coming from synthetic clothing that are being discharged through washing machine effluent. This is far and away the biggest contributor of persistent plastics to watersheds in the world. Between 1,900 and 1 million fragments from a single washing machine load of synthetic fabrics will be shed into the watershed. And if in a country like the US, you're talking about 89 million washing machines at about 9 loads a week. So when you do the math there, it's the cosmic heebie-jeebies, frankly. And what he's finding in the Gallatin is about 17 fragments per liter. Animals are interacting with it, they're breeding on it, they are eating it. About 600 species have been studied to eat plastics, and I'm going to get into a little more about why that's problematic. Animals are curious. They interact with anything in their environment, and anything that's floating by is called what's called a FAD, a fish attracting device or a fish aggregating device. There's safety in numbers, so anything floating by, they will hang out with. We found this fish, it's a triggerfish, in a squid trap. This bucket is a squid trap. Originally in Portugal, they were using these, they were made out of terracotta. And there'd be a hole in the bottom, you put it down in the water with a rope attached to it, and you could pull it up really fast because the water would go through the bottom and you could get the squid. These are now plastic buckets, and the North Atlantic is just littered with fragments of these and intact pieces. Well, this fish swam into this bucket at some point and couldn't turn around. And it continued to grow to be bigger than the opening of the bucket. We ultimately cut it out and we were like, is this fish actually been raised in captivity in the wild? So hopefully he survived. But why does this all matter? And this is the meat of the presentation, is why does this matter? Well, for one, we're changing, we're changing at a species level the amount of natural rafting for these animals to proliferate across the ocean. So these are tropical fish eggs in the North Pacific in a place they shouldn't be. And they are living and breeding on the plastics. So ultimately, when we look at this from a food system standpoint, if you study ingestion in fish, Scripps Institute of Oceanography put out a study that showed these type of fish, this big, mesopelagic fish, which represent about 50% of all fish in the ocean by weight, are fish this big. 9% of them are ingesting plastics. There's studies coming out now to show about 20 to 30%. We caught this little fish. It's called a rainbow runner. It's about this big, and we were going to eat it. When we opened it up, it had roughly 18 fragments of plastic in it. But here's the thing that's really problematic. So this is a picture of one of my colleagues. Her name's Dr. Chelsea Rockman. She's a UC Davis ecotoxicologist. And what she's doing is she's studying the amount of pollutants that are absorbed by the plastic. Plastic works like a sponge for persistent organic pollutants. So oil drops from your car, flame retardants, pesticide, all roll downhill, all absorbed by plastics, and they can be up to 1 million times more toxic than the ambient water around it. So when you have big animals eating little animals that have poison pills, what her research has showed is those chemicals are actually transferring to the fish tissue and biomagnifying up the food chain. So hold on, we're gonna get to some solutions to this, so don't slit your wrists yet. So if we look at consumption, this is the real problem. We live in a linear system, but our economy is based on infinite growth. The idea of a corporate entity is to grow and to increase capital for the shareholders. This isn't inherently bad, and I'm not saying this is bad, but we have to scale business at the level that the capacity of the ecosystem can handle. And right now, we are going directly against that. So if you look at how much the plastic production is as of 2014, it's roughly 100 times what it was 30 years ago. So what does this mean per capita? So every person in this room in the United States is responsible for 326 pounds of plastic per person per year. And that is going to jump to about 500 by 2025. So, and this is actually a good news slide. This is from Plastics Europe, a trade organization. And this is something that they put out to their investors saying, isn't this awesome, the growth of this product? So if this, I love this slide. This is done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And if you look at how we contribute globally to the plastics problem from 3 different sort of vantages. So 85% of the plastics in the world are created in fast-moving consumer goods are the United States and Europe. The plastics top 20 is 95% of all production, plastic production is 40%. But these are a comparative analysis from country to country responsible for putting this plastic in the ocean. So Asia produces very little comparatively as far as into the ocean, and the rest of the world is very small. So when I said that we export a lot of waste, we are responsible, in my opinion, for a lot of the blight we're putting on other countries. So let's talk about solutions finally, okay? Reduce. We have to start looking at this material from the vantage of it's useful for durable goods, for things we use for a really long time. I'm not anti-plastic at all, but I want it to be used responsibly. 50% of plastics are made for single use, as I mentioned. So that means if you quit using single-use plastic, you can cut your footprint by 50%. So when I talk to businesses working to scale their models, look at your waste stream. You're also going to be decreasing your carbon footprint significantly. Of all plastic production in the world, 6% goes into raw material from fossil fuels, 4% goes into transportation. So from a climate perspective, you're looking at 10% of fossil fuels are going to the production and transportation of plastics. So one thing I think, for people trying to figure out how are you going to connect and get involved in changing this, we have this really cool quiz on our site, Story of Stuff. And it's a Changemaker personality quiz, because not everybody's an activist. Many people are entrepreneurs. Many people are communicators or networkers. And this is a quiz you can take to figure out sort of where you fit in that. And any good movement is going to need all of these people, including business. So the circular economy, we have a make and throw away society right now, which means we are letting tons of things escape into the environment. We're externalizing the cost of the use of these items onto the environment. So this is a different way to look at it. We need to start looking at production and use of plastics in a circular fashion, that no nutrient, and when I say nutrient, I mean a building block of a useful good. There's technical nutrients, which are going to be persistent compounds, and biological nutrients like leaves and grass. They can be composted. So in a new plastics economy, we have to derive the value out, and anything that doesn't work in this model will ultimately shake out of the system, and we need to target that for elimination. Materials that we cannot consistently turn into other materials need to go. So what do you do about these kind of things? Well, I think as part of business and entrepreneurship is stewardship in your community. What I really like about the Sustainable Business Council is saying, hey, we're a group of businesses who actually care about this stuff, and we are going to collectively band together to influence policy in our community and try and keep this place, like especially Missoula, Montana. The number one resource here, in my opinion, is the beauty. And if you corrupt the beauty, people don't come here, and they don't buy lattes, and they don't buy pizza, and they don't travel around and rent bikes or whatever. So everything here is predicated on this notion that people come here for beauty. So I believe business pressure and civic engagement maxed together is essentially the way we create victories here. So also connecting very closely, I've talked a lot about the middle of the ocean. Nobody has a personal connection to the middle of the ocean. So I grew up in Minnesota, and the Great Lakes were ultimately the ocean to me as a kid. So I said, people have a serious personal connection to this place. This is everybody's 4th of July barbecue. This is a lot of good memories of weekends in the summer. So I said, let's look at plastics in the ocean. Found massive concentrations. And this is what we found. It actually looked quite beautiful when you look at them under a microscope, but ultimately, this is what they came from. These are employed as exfoliants in personal care products. About 3 trillion of these enter the ocean every year from the United States alone. And this is a manufactured demand. So when I say that, what I mean by that, this is a very core principle of the Story of Stuff project, is there are a lot of things that we sell that we don't need, and that we create a demand for them by preying on people's insecurities or their, in this case, their vanity. So what this product would promise is ultimately that you are going to be more beautiful, or more, you're going to have a better life or be more happy if you actually use this product. Well, ultimately, the companies knew that this was escaping wastewater treatment, that they were meant to go down the drain, and we targeted them for elimination very quickly. So it's really hard to read this, but when you want to talk about an unsustainable business model, Johnson & Johnson tries really hard in some places, and they're very poor in other places. And this is a place where they ultimately fail. Neutrogena is one of their brands. If you can read this, I love this. This was like everybody jumped up and down in the office when we read this. Microbeads are tiny balls used in exfoliating face and body washes. In personal care products, they act to gently scrub away dead skin in much the same way a sponge would. Use a sponge. I mean, come on, this is $9 a tube and you're going through it once a week. I'm like, seriously, you're admitting the uselessness of your own product in your personal sustainability statement. So collectively working, we reached out to Whole Foods. Whole Foods, I don't think there's one in Missoula, but typically they try pretty hard with their buying practices to stock sustainable stuff. and they voluntarily took them off the shelves and started putting pressures on the brands. So I was really impressed with this because they created a lot of political leverage for us. And I think as a business owner in a community, understand that because you're contributing to the economy, that gives you political leverage. Banding together, you can create change. And we won. We won a massive victory by, and I can, if anybody's interested in how I actually passed environmental legislation at the federal level, I can get into that in our talks afterwards. It was a very strategic campaign with a lot of businesses involved, a lot of people involved, but ultimately, yes, I don't know if you'll ever meet another person who passes environmental legislation at the federal level. So moving on to the next. We're working on Nestle right now. We're working on other useless products. Bottled water. Right now in Creston, there is a proposal for a 200 million gallon a day withdrawal from a private property. I'm really curious who's putting up the capital for that bottling plant. I believe it's got to be a multinational corporation, a la Nestle or Crystal Geyser, because just to build the bottling plant is $50 million. That's an incredible capital outlay. And we are working on a lawsuit in the San Bernardino National Forest in Southern California, where Nestle's been operating for about 28 years. We have banded businesses all throughout Redlands and San Bernardino to say, look, you're exporting our resource of water. People come here to hike in the forest, and you're drying it up, and all these species are leaving. They've operated for 30 years on an expired permit, so we sued the Forest Service to enforce this. 220 plastic water bottles per person per capita. That's not including soda. That's how many every person in the United States on a daily basis. In San Francisco, we banned bottled water on public property. I think when we're looking at festivals like in Caras Park, I know already you guys don't have bottled water available at these. Scaling events where businesses and communities meet together at the point of purchase and saying this product is unsustainable is an incredible education and opportunity for your customers and your constituents. So I like to say this, be the change as a business owner or be the target. You're going to be one or the other. So another grocery store that's about half the size of Whole Foods, we are targeting to eliminate selling Arrowhead brand water, which they're taking out of our mountains. I just got through a sort of chain of intel. Some things get cloak and dagger in the activist world, and I heard that Nestle just flew to Sprouts headquarters to talk about this petition. It's now garnered over 100,000 signatures, and Sprouts is freaking out a little bit because everybody has looked at them as ultimately this bastion of sustainability. So we targeted them. So this is my second to last slide. And when I like to talk about waste with businesses, when you're trying to figure out what are the things to target, because this is such an overwhelming problem. The best things to look at are the things that are in the environment the most. This is from International Coastal Cleanup Day, which is a worldwide day in September where people en masse clean up the ocean. The Ocean Conservancy compiles this data. So 80% of the litter found in watersheds and beaches and river cleanups are these 10 items. This, from a waste perspective in your model, is what you target and try and get out. If you have a restaurant and you're putting ketchup in a plastic container, go with a metal or a ceramic ramekin. So this, I think, is marching orders for looking at a sustainable model. Also going to drop your costs. Like, the thing about disposable plastics is they cost a tremendous amount of money. When you pull back on them, ultimately you will find a net savings to your overall model. So this is my contact information. I love talking to folks. what the story of stuff does ultimately is we tell these amazing stories. We bottom line certain campaigns, but what we're really trying to do is serve as the connective tissue for all these disparate communities who are working on these issues. So it was interesting. I was in City Hall today talking to some of the mayor's staff about composting and working on those sort of issues. And they were interested in looking at how much of a waste reduction this could be for the goal of 2050 for a 90% diversion from landfill in Missoula. And I said, well, you know, composting is 42%. If you separate your organics from your papers and your plastics, you will divert 42% of your waste in a year. I worked on a campaign in Portland that did this. In 1 year, we achieved it. And ultimately, it was rate neutral, because what we found is that you didn't have to pick up garbage every other week. And we were working with both public and private haulers. So I was like, well, I know the architect of the system, you guys want to talk to her? And they were like, yes, please. So immediately got my phone out and connected them together. But there's people all over the world working on, who found solutions to a lot of these problems. There just is no connective tissue. And what I'm here to do is be that connective tissue. And for the people I speak to as well who are working on these issues, I give my contact information freely, and I will get back to you if you're looking to try and solve some of these problems within your own business paradigm. So thank you very much. It is so great to be at the University of Montana. Again, I'm very happy to be in Montana. I miss it so much. It's the most beautiful place I've ever been, and I've traveled a lot. So thank you very much.
Let's do a little Q&A if we have some conversation to be had, and then just so you know, after this we are going to head over to Charlie B's, and Stiv used to work there and he needs a little dino food. So is there anyone who currently has a question? Yes?
Did I understand you said they're putting in that bottling plant in Creston, Montana?
Yes. There's now a face group working on opposing it, or I shouldn't say opposing it, trying to determine whether the aquifer can really handle it or not. It's just formed, but the wagons are sort of circling to try and determine whether this is a good or bad idea up there. So get involved. Yeah.
I used to do landscaping for a few years, and what I discovered was that it was becoming more and more popular. Instead of using wood, they were using this product called Trex to build like decks and that kind of thing. And I found out that it was, they derive it and they produce it out of recycled shopping bags,
Yep.
that kind of plastic. And I really thought that was interesting, and my boss said, you know, that it takes, you know, X thousand plastic bags to make one of these. And I thought, well, that's kind of got a nice little byproduct, and it lasts longer than wood. It apparently people like it more. Are you aware of anything else like that that's kind of sprung up where they're kind of turning this waste into a new product or anything like that on a large scale?
Yeah, there are a lot of companies working on decking materials, synthetic building materials, insulating materials, and I say yes, Trex is an interesting concept. The problem is it's 1/50, the total demand for that decking or park bench material is 1/50th of the amount of plastic bags that are produced and consumed. So it's part of the solution, maybe, but ultimately we can't, you know, the rhetoric of the plastic bag industry will be like, well, we make decking materials out of it. And I'm like, well, you deal with, you know, 2% of generation, which ultimately is not going to systemically solve the problem. And then the other problem is this does last longer, but it isn't a renewable resource. Wood is. There are ways to manage wood in such a way that you can continually build things out of it, and manage forests. It's challenging, I give you that. And you know, and forest politics are very difficult. But ultimately, this has a lifespan as well, and it's about 25 years, roughly. And the whole time it's shedding persistent compounds into the environment. And I think one thing to realize is recycling is a business, and the feedstock that goes into the thing is going to be the same that comes out of the thing. So the axiom I sort of live by is, if it's toxic to begin with, whatever you make out of it is going to be toxic again. Toxics in, toxics out. So simple erosion from wind and storms, eventually when that stuff becomes brittle and useless, it is shedded tons of small particles into the environment. So I'm not trying to say that it's a bad idea. If the polymer was more sustainable or more benign by design to begin with, then it'd be a great application for it. But just because we can make one thing out of another thing doesn't mean it's ultimately going to solve the problem, especially if the supply side far outweighs the demand side. And that's the problem with a single-use input in economically. If we're using things over and discarding them for just, using them in just seconds and discarding them, there's only so many laundry baskets, Rubbermaid tubs, car bumpers that are going to last for 20 years as an output. So the demand for recycled plastics, or for recycled plastic, is always going to be degrees of scale smaller than the supply, no matter what, because you have a massive generation and a durable good output. So I don't mean to ruin your day, but yeah.
So, as you said, the majority of the plastics come from the petroleum industry. And so if you push back on the plastics, then it's basically you've got more fuel for energy. How do you balance the waste to energy streams? There are people that have EPA-approved means of turning plastic into energy versus what happens on the other end, burning fossil fuels. How do you balance those two things?
So the most efficient incinerators, waste to energy projects in the world right now are much more carbon intensive than coal, for example. So to get that energy, you're putting tremendous amount of greenhouse gases into the world. There's the brands, the resin makers, like DuPont, Dow, they're very interested in incineration because they know, with the problem I just explained to this gentleman, they know the only way they can continue a status quo of infinite growth in a linear system is to burn it at the end. The problem is when you burn something, only 2/3 of its volume go away. And if whatever chemical that's made of is going to have what are called metabolite compounds. When it's combusted, it'll turn into other things like dioxins or stuff that is very dangerous. The leading proposition for solving waste in these 5 Asian countries that I definitely did in the talk this morning, that put about 80% of the plastics into the ocean, is to incinerate it. And the brands are lining up right now to put in $100 million to $1 billion to build that burn infrastructure. And the problem is, to get the energy out of it, you got to quit recycling. Because if you're burning banana peels and dead cats, there isn't much BTUs in that. It's not much of energy. If you put in a solid piece of plastic, you get it. So it's interesting. I'm working in the Philippines. They have an incinerator ban. And one of the gentlemen I'm working for won the Goldman Prize, the most prestigious environmental prize you can win, for enacting that ban. The brands are actively trying to undo that ban when the Philippines is trying very hard to promote zero waste models. And their models are so successful that they are diverting 93% from the landfill. And they are shaking out about 7% of residuals, bad materials that have no recyclability. So the problem is if these incinerators get built on a 30-year contract, you are entrenching that type of fast-moving consumer good far into the future, which what you're going to do is destroy the zero waste movement in the Philippines. And what's funny is the capital needed to build an incinerator is like 1 to 2 billion per, depending. It's very difficult to apply to the developing world because you have political corruption, you have no environmental controls or ability to monitor. So the way you make these things create the most energy is to scale, is to put the emissions out into the world. And I mean, I can show you a bazillion health studies of people around incinerators that are affected. So, and I also think ultimately it's not the right way to look at the problem. The problem is like, it's like, don't make a mess to begin with and try and figure out how to clean it up. And that's what incineration really is. It's an end of pipe solution, not a transformative or a structural solution that is trying to stop the input into the system that's unsustainable. Yeah, you waving at me.
So, in Stiv's world, in Stiv's future, how does consumer culture work with fewer single-use plastics?
It's a really, really good question. So we crunch a lot of data at the project to try and figure out what are the drivers of consumerism and what makes people happy. We find that food and service-oriented economies produce a much higher degree of happiness than consumptive economies. So, and if you, this guy, God, I can't remember his name. He's done tremendous work from Montana State University. He's a professor there. Apparently he is a Grizz fan. He's done an incredible amount of analysis between extractive economies versus experience-based economies. So removing a mountaintop to get coal out versus creating a mountain bike Shangri-La in Moab, Utah, for example. What he finds is that it's a much more sustainable trajectory. Extractive economies are boom and bust by nature. As soon as the resource is gone or too expensive to get out of the ground, it busts. And we're watching that in Bismarck, North Dakota right now, like en masse. So when you ask what the future looks like, it's experience-based. And if you look at the psychology of this as well, and you look at how serotonin levels work in the brain, when you buy something, your serotonin spikes. It's like crack. And then the next day you are lower than when you bought it. If you look at experience-based economies, it's a slow, steady input of happiness. So get out there and see the world, I guess.
I don't get that feeling when I buy my dental floss or my toothpaste.
Sure. But what's your dental floss made of? You can get it out of cotton and woven organic fabrics. Might be a little more expensive. You can buy it in, I mean, I use dental floss and it's on a aluminum spool and it's hemp. And that's what I think dental floss should be made out of. Not out of something with over 100 chemical ingredients in a packaging that can't be recycled. So I think it's like really looking at, you know, I say the best advice is if you can't pronounce it, don't put it on your body or put it in your body. And buy that which is packaged the least. Because there is power from a consumer standpoint. I think it's a great place to start. Personal efficiencies, responsible buying practices, it's a terrible place to stop. The only way we create systemic change in a future that I believe in is to work together. We have a great cartoon about this. It's called The Story of Change. Because we're not going to reusable water bottle, coffee cup, bag our way out of a serious environmental problem. We have to work together with business and communities to flex our citizen muscles, take our civic rights, and get people in office who represent those values. Ultimately, because otherwise I don't think we win. Sure.
This question kind of piggybacks that question, and kind of digging a little deeper on what you were just talking about. How do you wrestle with the question of convenience You know, I hear your talk and I think about those, you know, shining Swiffer commercials.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I mean, I don't own a TV, and I don't mean that to sound like, you know, I'm the guy who doesn't own a TV. I live on a sailboat. I don't have a TV. There isn't room. But, you know, when I'm home at the holidays and I'm like trying to get away from my crazy family in the basement, like binge watching cable television or in a hotel room or something, I see these commercials, these Swiffer commercials that promise this like incredible life, but the story that they're selling it to is so infantilizing to me. Like the infantilization of our consumer culture blows my mind. I'm like, it is not hard to push a mop. It just ain't. You know, I mean, a Swiffer is really not that much more convenient by any stretch, especially for the cost it has on the environment. And so, true, I mean, people like convenience. You know, that first slide I showed, that is the beginning of convenience culture. Well, I think taking a little personal responsibility, teaching your children, doing this in your business, saying, hey, if you take, you know, if you bring a reusable cup and I'm a barista, I'm going to give you a serious discount. Like, and try, you know, I've been talking with the sustainability manager at Starbucks. Starbucks is, you know, they get targeted for a lot of they get a lot of hate. But they are actually really interested in climate change because that's where, like equatorial places, that's where coffee grows. And so there's a threat to their business from climate change. And also the waste produced. They're really concerned about that. I mean, they go through like 500 million coffee cups a day in the United States. I mean, 500 million a day. And they are trying very hard to scale something that still allows you to deliver that product, because they're in the business of selling coffee, not a cup and a lid. That's not what they sell. They sell coffee. And so ultimately, their approach to it is, how do we incentivize reuse to such a degree that our consumers will change? And they're going to start experimenting with like a 50-cent discount. And the difference culturally in the notions of convenience, just in coffee, in the United States, 99% of people walk into a Starbucks, take their coffee to go. Only 50% do in Europe. So tactically, you approach that very differently. But it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, but that is the third rail when you talk to the health department.
Yes. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what the health code is here, but I'm working with United Airlines to get bottled water off of planes and allow reusable cups. So if you've ever been on an airline, you try and give them your reusable bottle, say, no, the health department won't let us, FAA regulations. Doesn't exist. It's pure fabrication. There is nothing on an airline that says we can't fill your reusable cup. What you can't do is touch one to the other. That's where the cross-contamination occurs. But I think the health department, I mean, the more we engage with the health department, the more they're going to look at this, you know, as some of their policies are just insane. You know, we are not. We are marketed to that everything is out to get you and you need to be protected this way, and it's just become part of our culture. You know, if you want, and I always say, like, you know, when you're raising kids, the more they're playing in the dirt, the healthier their immune system's going to be, frankly. So yeah, no, I mean, that too is a big issue. It is another part of society where civic engagement and working en masse from business pressure, saying, hey, my customers don't like all this waste generation of this festival I'm participating in. We need to change this. So you can eventually create leverage because you represent an economic interest in the community.
We probably have time for like 2 or 3 more.
2 or 3 more, and then I'm happy to talk to the gentleman in the hat behind that, the other gentleman. Yes, you have the hat.
Thank you for coming. So seeing that epidemic
Oh, I met you. Free cycle. Cool. Yeah.
See that epidemic of plastic, an epidemic of cancer and other diseases. So can you speak towards this health connection of plastic being in our air, our soil, our water, everywhere?
It's a really good point to make. So if, for those of you who didn't hear, is like, what is the connection between plastics, toxics, and human health? Science is really working very hard to answer this question. Here's the problem, is the toxins we're talking about are bioaccumulative, which means that if you are the first generation exposed to low dose chronic amounts of these toxins, you're probably going to be okay. And the fundamental principle to understand about toxicity is that everything in the world is toxic depending on the dose, even water. If you drink too much water, you will have a toxic reaction to it. The problem is a lot of these compounds that we use chemically, and certainly the building blocks of plastic, are cumulative from generation to generation. So each subsequent generation has a higher body burden of those contaminants. The only way you get rid of them as a man, you simply can't. As a woman, it's through breast milk and the umbilical cord. It's the only way you do it. And if we are looking at the canary in the coal mine, in Southeast Asia and around the Hong Kong area, in that archipelago, there's a lot of studies being done on dolphins, where they're having a 60 to 70% infant mortality rate for the firstborn, because these dolphins are drinking poisoned milk. Now, marine mammals are an extreme disadvantage to even humans or other land-based mammals, because they are 99% fat. Like a seal or a whale or a dolphin is that their whole, like, aside from their their organs, their entire body is made of fat and muscle tissue, which is highly absorptive of these chemicals. But I look at, wow, 1 out of 2 firstborn dolphins are being killed in a highly industrial society in a mega city and the waters around it. How many generations of exposure of humans does it take till we become that? Because it works scientifically and it works accumulatively. So ultimately, we may not be at a serious threat from chronic exposure to chemicals at this point, but what about the next generation? One more question, and you, sir. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm from Bangladesh. I'm here to.
You're from Bangladesh?
Yeah. So thanks for the exciting presentation. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm here just for 2 weeks, part of the company program. My concern is that you know that for sustainable development.
I'm sorry, I just can't hear you.
Yeah, because the sustainable development goal right now we are implementing.
I'm gonna come up there. Sorry, I love Bangladesh. It's the first first plastic bag ban in the world, and met the activist who did it, who was exiled to the United States for 10 years, death threats from the government. Yeah, interesting place to work.
Yeah. I'm sure that you have been and you know that how we are using our wastage. Yeah, I have some experience of using the wastage, particularly garments wastage in using. Yeah, we have some product. Anyway, but my question is that what is the prospect of using the to make a business, to create an entrepreneur reusing the plastic or these stuffs, and what is the policy of the US government to promote the waste management related business?
What is the waste management of that business?
Yeah. Particularly if I want to start a business using plastic or reusing plastic.
Sure.
Yeah. What's the policy?
Yeah. So the gentleman's question is essentially, coming from a developing world perspective, what ultimately is how should you treat these waste plastics? Because certainly in Bangladesh, a lot of this refuse is made into other things and people are selling it. So how do you deal with that? The system has to change, and frankly, I'm trying to answer that question by building a massive global campaign right now where you talk to the stakeholders in the developing world who are dealing with the materials, and you target the campaigns on the developed world that are ultimately having, our consumption is having an asymmetric effect. It's an environmental justice issue, frankly. And so there's no simple answer to that question, because I don't want to ban something that takes away somebody's livelihood ultimately. What the best thing we can do is make that person, that entrepreneur who is working with those waste materials, a stakeholder in the discussion of the policy that moves forward. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is marry the global north and the global south and have that lines of communications going both ways. And it's going to be a tremendous project. I mean, we are literally building a $100 million campaign to solve waste issues in these countries. But ultimately, the rule of the number one rule of grassroots activism 101 is you have to listen to the people who are going to be affected by the policy you're trying to implement. So absolutely inviting those people to the table. So I'm happy to chat a little bit afterwards. We're going to wrap up here. Thank you. I want to say a few thank yous. Thank you to Sustainable Business Council for getting me out here and being able to give this talk. Personally, just want to thank Silk Road, what an amazing place to eat. Great event for us on Monday. Goldsmiths, you're just sitting on the river. It's gorgeous. It's a wonderful place. So, and really great hosts. Thank you so much to them. And also for the lovely reception at Buttercup before this. Thank you so much. Happy to chat afterwards. I've got a stack of business cards too. And thanks again.
One more big one to Stiv, and this is a small token
of
our
thank
affection. A reusable bag.
You need that?
And one last thank you to MCAT. So you'll be able to watch this. It'll be recorded on MCAT and broadcast there and through the Sustainable Business Council. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's awesome.